Welcome to the Martin Bailey Photography Podcast. It's July 14, 2020, and this is episode 714. It's here. On August 6, a week after the initial release, I picked up my Canon EOS R5. As usual, I have watched with a smile as most of the online photography community has bashed this camera and looked for reasons not to buy it. The video overheating issues we're hearing about is the most common and seems to have somehow been extrapolated out to give people what they feel to be a valid reason to spout negatively about the camera that hardly any of them have even held. Well, it gives me great pleasure to tell you that this is, without a shadow of a doubt, simply the best camera that Canon has ever made, in all respects, including video. If you need an 8K video camera, buy an 8K video camera. But if you need a stills camera that does everything it was designed for, including up to 20 frames per second stills photography at 45 megapixels, you can't go wrong with the EOS R5. The 8K video features are awesome, as is the ability to shoot full-frame 4K video at up to 120 frames per second. But these are, in my opinion, bonus features and should be treated as such. If Canon intended the R5 to be a video camera, they would have added fans and vents to keep the sensor and memory card cool. But guess what? Adding vents on a stills camera compromises the weatherproofing, and personally I would prefer to own a camera that I can use in bad weather rather than a camera that allows me to shoot unlimited length 8K video. I'm excited about the 8K video and the high frame rate 4K video, but as I said, this is a bonus and I'll use it as it allows. I'm not going to list all of the main features of the EOS R5, mostly because you can get a full rundown of all the amazing features of this camera on Canon's websites worldwide. But I do want to quickly mention the main points and the reasons why I ordered this camera as soon as it was possible to do so. To me, the most exciting features of the EOS R5 are the fast frame rate and high resolution images. These two things never used to come together. For the first 2 decades of mainstream digital photography, we could have one or the other. Fast frame rate and lower resolutions, or higher resolution and low frame rate. When I saw the specs for the EOS R5, I knew that Canon must have moved to a new card format, but I admit that I did not have my antenna out to catch information about the CF Express standard until I saw the specs for the R5. It was not much of a surprise for me to learn that ProGrade Digital, the memory card manufacturer that I've been using exclusively for the last 2 years, was on the bleeding edge of this new technology. In the spirit of full disclosure, I would like to mention that although I bought my first 512GB ProGrade Digital CF Express card and their Thunderbolt 3 card reader, they were kind enough to send me other cards that I have used to test and report on in the previous post and will also be using for the tests that I report on in this review. Back to my point though, it is completely awesome that the Canon EOS R5 has delivered both high frame rate shooting with high resolution 45 megapixel images. I wouldn't have thought it possible, but as my tests have showed, it absolutely is, and I'm completely excited about this. The other thing that I knew would happen is the improved refresh rate and clarity of the electronic viewfinder. I really enjoyed shooting with the EOS R bodies over the last 2 years, but it was without doubt a stepping stone camera, and using it to shoot wildlife worked, but it required patience to work with the viewfinder for fast-paced shooting, and on occasion would cost me a shot or two as the camera simply wouldn't be able to keep up with the pace of shooting and my often very quickly moving subjects. I can't share footage of this, but I have had my wife dart around our apartment and disappear behind the sofa and doors, and I am completely confident that the improvements that Canon has made to both the viewfinder and the autofocus system are worlds ahead of what we have in the EOS R, and I knew that would be the case. I have also been highly impressed with the ability of the new autofocus system to track with the eye of not only humans but with animals now. I found that the EOS R worked well with monkeys because they're similar to us, but the EOS R5 now supports tracking of a number of animals including dogs, cats and birds. So I'm looking forward to getting out into the field more with the R5 and really putting these new features to the test. Last but not least, I was somewhat excited by the addition of in-body image stabilization and have been blown away to find that this works incredibly well with my RF 50mm f1.2L lens, despite it not having IS built into the lens itself. And I'll touch on this more in my review as well. Note that when I moved to mirrorless with Canon, I made a decision to no longer buy the battery grips for my cameras. I sometimes miss not having the vertical grip, and I have found that with the R5 the batteries do run out relatively quickly, probably due to the in-body image stabilization and perhaps also to extra power needed to run the CF Express cards. I've not checked on this though, but the CF Express cards are generating heat and that has to come from somewhere, so I assume they're using more power. I'll correct myself later if I'm wrong on this. I decided to keep my cameras lower profile from now on though, and initially wondered if this might prevent me from reaching the maximum frame rate, but that was not the case, as I'll share with you shortly. Thinking about it, something else that I wanted to note is that I was at one point concerned that the EOS R5 might not have an articulated LCD, as this somewhat compromises the weatherproofing, and Canon have historically only used articulated LCDs on lower end cameras, so I was happy to read a while back that the R5 does indeed have an articulated LCD. I have become accustomed to pulling out and using this for low angle shooting and also for video when I have to see what I'm shooting from the front of the camera, so I didn't want to lose this functionality in the R5. Okay, so with those observations out of the way, let's jump deeper into this as I share my findings having actually used the camera. The first thing that I noticed and wanted to talk about is the workaround that most people are using to process EOS R5 RAW files. Most photo editing software such as Capture One Pro, my personal choice, does not yet natively support R5 RAW files, and I initially used the Adobe DNG converter software to convert my images to DNG files, and they can be imported into Capture One Pro. However, when I compared the results of my ISO performance test, pitching the R5 against the EOS R, it became obvious that as the ISO increases, the DNG converted files are not being processed correctly in Capture One Pro. I've included a screenshot and actually lots of other images in this review, so if you're not already on the blog looking at the images in detail, you can find the blog post at mbp.ac/714. The first screenshot that I want you to look at is 12 shots in Capture One Pro. The first 11 are converted DNG files, starting at ISO 100 and working up to ISO 102,400, which is the second to last image. The final image in the bottom right corner though is the same image at ISO 102,400 but processed in Canon's Digital Photo Professional, and Adobe Bridge and Photoshop display the image with the correct colors too. So if you use Capture One Pro and high ISOs, be aware that you may not be getting accurate color until Phase 1 releases an update with official support for the Canon EOS R5. So as I work on this review, there are a number of things that are really important to me. The first being image quality and ISO performance. And then I'm going to test the frame rate, as this camera is opening up some very interesting doors for wildlife and sports photographers. I'll also test the raw image buffer and see if it's possible to fill it, and if it is, how long it takes to free up and enable us to continue to shoot. Let's start with a look at the image quality. Because Capture One Pro does not yet support the EOS R5 images, and there is a problem with using converted DNG files with Capture One Pro, I'm faced with a bit of dilemma. I tried outputting TIFF files from Canon's Digital Photo Professional, but the image quality is not as good as Capture One Pro, which is of course why I use Capture One Pro, but I need to show you an apples to apples comparison. What I've decided to do for this test is to share a high resolution screenshot of 4 images displayed simultaneously. The top left image is the EOS R5 RAW file converted to DNG, and for this test it's not a problem because the image has no color to get messed up. The top right image is the raw image from the EOS R as a direct comparison for the top left image. The bottom 2 images are TIFF files processed in Digital Photo Professional with no processing except the standard raw sharpening, which is the same processing as Capture One Pro. What I need you to do is to click on the image on the blog and open it in the lightbox, and then click on the cloud icon in the top right with the down arrow in it, and that should enable you to download the image to your computer for closer inspection. What you'll find is that apart from the EOS R5 image being obviously higher resolution, as in it's larger than the EOS R image because both are zoomed in to 100%, but apart from that, the image quality as such is pretty much the same. This is to be expected because the EOS R with RF lenses is also incredibly good quality. I'd also like you to look at the bottom 2 DPP processed images, and you'll be able to confirm that they are slightly softer. They aren't as sharp, and that is why I could not do an apples to apples comparison using these TIFF files. I think you'll agree though that as far as resolution is concerned, there is nothing to be concerned about. Both images were shot with the RF 50mm f1.2L lens at f8 ISO 100. My dilemma continues now as I try to show you the ISO performance test results. What I've decided to do is to share pairs of images from each camera, the EOS R5 and the EOS R. The first image of each pair is a 100% crop from a TIFF file with both sharpening and noise reduction applied in Canon's Digital Photo Professional software. The second image only has sharpening applied so that you can get a better idea of the actual amount of grain in the image, as well as seeing how well this can be cleaned up with DPP. Capture One Pro also cleans up the images nicely even with its default settings, but I'd rather not share the images from the DNG converted RAW files because of the color issues at high ISOs that I mentioned earlier. I'm also going to group all of the images by ISO, so as you click through these in the lightbox, you'll see 4 ISO 100 images, starting with a pair from the EOS R5, with one image having had DPP processing and a second with just sharpening, and then the same processing options for another pair of images from the EOS R for comparison. I selected the area of the image that I focused on to zoom in to 100% because it shows both the detail and noise levels in the shadow and darker areas of the image. Note too that I am exposing to the right for these shots, with almost 2 stops of additional exposure to ensure that the whites are white. This is how I shoot everything, and it does result in less grain and therefore better ISO performance, which is the whole point of this test. I think you'll probably agree that there is no real visible noise in any of the images up to ISO 6400, with the noise reduction turned off. But in the images that had DPP noise reduction turned on, it really doesn't start to be visible until ISO 12800, and even that is very usable from both cameras. ISO 25600 without noise reduction starts to look pretty nasty, but again very respectable when noise reduction is applied. At ISO 51200 both cameras start to show a lot of grain, although could arguably be used at a push. And then from the massive 102,400, that is the highest ISO that both cameras will shoot at, it seems that the Canon noise reduction is actually a little too heavy-handed on the R5 image as we start to lose detail in the flowers, and the EOS R actually looks slightly better. For the final set, I've also added a Capture One Pro processed version, as I think Capture One is slightly kinder on the detail, but keep in mind that the colours are messed up without official support yet for the EOS R5. The verdict from my ISO tests is that the ISO performance of the Canon EOS R5 is pretty much across the board very similar, even close to identical to the EOS R. But when we consider that the EOS R5 is 45 megapixels compared to the 30 megapixels of the EOS R, keeping the ISO performance on par with the EOS R is an incredible feat in itself. Based on my tests, I always commit to memory a soft and hard ceiling for how high I will take my ISO in the field. And for the EOS R5, as with the EOS R, I'm going to consider going as high as 12,800, a no-brainer, and will use ISO 25,600 when necessary, and probably also shoot at 51,200 at a push. I will probably turn off the expandable high ISO of 102,400, as I doubt I'll ever use it. But with a usable 51,200, who cares? I have also tested the frame rate and raw buffer, so let's take a look at the results of these tests now. I haven't had an opportunity to shoot any wildlife yet, so these results are from tests in my studio, but I think you'll find this useful. The first observation is that using ProGrade Digital's Cobalt cards with the electronic first curtain shutter, it is not possible to fill the buffer. To simulate some fast-paced shooting settings in conditions that I often work in, I increased my ISO to 800 and I used a shutter speed of a 250th of a second. That could have been faster, but I didn't have much light and I wanted to actually record images rather than black frames so that the camera had something to process. When I started to shoot, the raw buffer was displaying at 56, and I mashed down on the shutter button and kept it pressed down for around 200 frames with no sign of slowing down. I released my finger and the raw buffer still said 56, so the camera was emptying its buffer to the card as quickly as I could shoot them, and that is very impressive. I counted the number of images that I was able to shoot each second, and for the first burst shot with electronic first curtain shutter, I was seeing a constant switching back and forth between 8 and 9 frames for a fraction over 20 seconds, and I ended up with a total of 181 images. So my first frame rate at ISO 800 was slightly under 9 frames per second, and that is very nice. Just under what Canon claims, but with the ISO increased, that's to be expected. I then switched to the electronic shutter and found that even at ISO 800, I was able to get 20 frames per second for the first 5 seconds. The camera didn't skip a beat, giving me more than 100 frames at 20 frames per second. And then I did hit the full buffer from around frame 113, giving me just 13 frames for the 6th consecutive second in a burst. That then dropped to 7 frames for my 7th second, then just 1 frame during my 8th second, and then back up to 6 frames for my 9th second. Basically, the 20 frames per second is available for bursts of up to 5 to 6 seconds, or just over 100 frames, and that is amazing. What's more, with the CF Express card, if you give the camera just a second or two, it writes the frames in the buffer to the card and you're ready to start shooting again. I haven't tested this with wildlife yet, and I do not know if there will be any problems caused by the rolling shutter, but I imagine with some fast moving subjects there will be some traces of movement during the exposure. So we may have to drop to the electronic first curtain shutter anyway. I will still give this a try when possible and report back on my findings. Honestly though, if I can get around 8 to 9 frames per second with electronic first curtain, that is plenty for me to nail my wildlife shots. I've been nailing shots based on good timing and technique with as little as 2 to 3 frames per second for the last 5 years or so anything above that is a bonus for me anyway. Finally, I tested the mechanical shutter frame rate and was pleasantly surprised to find that it's pretty much identical to the electronic first curtain frame rate, giving me 9 frames per second for 4 out of 5 seconds and dropping to 8 once every 5 seconds. So we're talking an average frame rate of around 8.8 frames per second. Again, for the mechanical shutter, that is incredible, especially when we consider that the images are 45 megapixels. All of the previous frame rate and buffer tests were performed with the ProGrade Digital 325GB Cobalt CF Express card, so I ran the same tests with their 512GB and 1TB gold cards as well, as these are less expensive but come with slower write speeds, as I mentioned in my recent review. I'm really pleased to report though that with the mechanical shutter the frame rate was the same as the Cobalt cards, coming in at 9 frames per second for 4 out of 5 seconds and drops to 8 frames for 1 second out of 5, so we're looking at an average frame rate of 8.8 frames per second. The buffer did not fill while using the mechanical shutter, and after shooting a burst of around 80 images, I took my finger off the shutter button and the buffer showed that it was around 5 frames down from 66, which is my buffer at ISO 100, as I had a little more light for these tests. My shutter speed was still at a 250th of a second, as with my earlier tests. With the electronic first curtain shutter, I actually got more seconds at 9 frames per second, and once again the buffer was just a few frames down after a burst and replenished almost instantly. With the electronic shutter, I continued to get straight 20 frames per second for the full 66 frame of my buffer, but then the buffer filled and the camera pretty much locked up and it took around 12 seconds for the camera to write the full buffer of images to the gold card, compared to just a few seconds with the cobalt card. When you consider that this was following a burst of 66 images at 20 frames per second though, in practical terms I really don't think this is a big deal. It basically means that both the pro-grade digital cobalt and gold cards work incredibly well with the Canon EOS R5. I will use the cobalt cards for critical frame rate, fast-paced wildlife work, but the gold cards are a chunk of change less than the cobalt cards, and with these results I'd say they're a very good alternative, giving excellent results if you are watching your pennies. Note too that I also tested shooting with the pro-grade digital cobalt SDXC card and got 83 frames in a single burst, and once the buffer filled it took just 6 seconds to write the images to the card, and the camera was ready to shoot again with an empty buffer. This means that it took half the time to empty the buffer than the CF Express Gold card. So if you don't need to shoot 8K video or high frame rate 4K video and you want to save even more pennies, then a Cobalt SDXC card is a viable alternative, even compared to a gold CF Express card. This is also good to know if you already have a fast SDXC card, and makes using the SDXC slot a viable option for switching cards, and even as the first choice to store your images to, say for example, if you want to store just your videos on the CF Express card and automatically write your stills to the SDXC card. Under the Record Func Plus card /folder select option on the setup one screen in the R5's menu, you can tell the camera to record stills and video to separate cards, or have either stills or video automatically switch cards when one is full. You can also save RAW format video on the CF Express card and MP4 compressed video to the SDXC card. I've had video cut out due to a full card on the EOS R because it only had one slot, so I will be leaving a Cobalt SDXC card in the second slot and allowing at least video to spill over to the second card when necessary, assuming it doesn't overheat first, of course, and we'll get to that in a moment. I was so impressed with the speed at which I can transfer my image files and video to my computer that I created a short video in which I monitor the time required to copy a 107.5 gigabyte 8K video file and just short of 250 megabyte image files from the pro-grade digital 325 gigabyte Cobalt CF Express card using their Thunderbolt 3 card reader. The video is to provide proof rather than entertainment, so to be a blatant spoiler, the video file takes just 1 minute 7 seconds, and just under 200 images takes a hair under 10 seconds to copy across, which is about 20 images per second. Although stills are my main gig, I do shoot video sometimes, and as I mentioned earlier, I am excited about the 8K video and high frame rate 4K video. So I've done some limited tests of recording video to see roughly how bad the overheating issues that everyone is complaining about really are. In my studio with the air conditioning on and the temperature still sitting at around 32 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and using the fastest pro-grade digital 325 gigabyte Cobalt CF Express card, I recorded about a minute of 8KD 29.97 all-eye video and stopped it, and then recorded another 11 minutes, at which point the overheat icon displayed on the LCD of the EOS R5. I was holding the camera with both hands and not letting much air circulate around it, but that's all I got. After letting the camera cool down for an hour or so, I switched to 8K D29.97 IPB video, and this time I used the 1TB gold CF Express card from ProGrade Digital and was able to shoot for just over 17 minutes before the overheat icon started to flash on my screen. I could probably leave it running a while longer, but the manual says to turn the camera off when that icon is displayed, so I've been doing just that and allowing the camera to cool down for an hour or so. As a third test, I switched to the 512GB gold card from ProGrade and started to shoot some 119 frames per second 4K video, which is also very demanding on the camera and the memory card, and I was able to record without any problems speed-wise, but I had this time only given the camera about 10 minutes to cool down, so it started to overheat again after just 4 minutes. Once again, my studio was warm and I didn't give the camera long to cool down, so this is about what I expected. I'm going to stop my video tests there because I've found that I can shoot clips that are probably plenty long enough for my usual video work, as it's usually not that big a part of my work, and I have also confirmed that I can write to the ProGrade Digital Gold cards pretty much in the same way as I can write to their Cobalt cards. I do still intend to pick up a 650GB Cobalt card probably in September when I get the 100 to 500mm RF lens and sell my EOS R and my EF 100 to 400mm lens, as they, along with what's left on my camera store point card, will cover the cost of a second EOS R5. And of course, because I do always travel and work with two identical bodies, if one overheats for video and I really need to continue shooting, I can always switch bodies while the other cools down. One thing to note, and this is a very important aspect for me, is that you can always shoot stills. If the camera is in an overheat state from shooting video and you switch to stills, you can continue to shoot without any problems. The overheating applies to video shooting only and does not hinder the shooting of still photographs. Before we start to wrap this up, I'd like to share a handful of example photos that I shot on the day that I got the camera and the following day, to start to get used to shooting with the Canon EOS R5. Again, these are converted to DNG and processed in Capture One Pro, but the ISO was down at 100, so the colours shouldn't be out of whack. I would usually make the blues a little more vibrant as I was shooting towards the sun a little, but I've left this as it was shot so that you can see what we get in these conditions straight out of the camera. I was impressed with how well the EOS R5 handled the contrast with the starburst on the tower, and the shadow side details look great, as does the detail in the dark green summer leaves. I was disappointed that Canon decided to leave GPS out of the R5. I know that they've built in the ability to link the camera to a phone and use GPS data from the phone, but I honestly can't imagine that this is much better on the camera's battery than simply running an internal GPS unit. I'm honestly tired of attaching my GP-E2 to the top of my camera all the time, and every camera that Canon has released for the last 8 years or so that I have not bought has had GPS built in, and I find that really annoying. Luckily, that is the only thing that I find annoying about this camera. Everything else is nothing short of amazing. Next, I'm sharing another test shot, this time looking down the stairs of the Cocoon building. I like to shoot this as a test because it gives me a good idea of how well the camera handles contrast and shadows. I increased my ISO to 160 for this to get the shutter speed to 1/100th of a second. I was using my new RF 15 to 35mm f2.8L lens with IS, which coupled with the new in-body IS of the R5 gives me a total of 7 stops of image stabilization, but I didn't want the person walking up the stairs to blur more than this. Incidentally, Canon has announced that the RF 24 to 105mm f4 lens gets 8 stops of stabilization, and even my 50mm f1.2 lens gets 7 stops of stabilization, despite not actually having its own internal image stabilization. That's all from the in-body image stabilization. Kind of as a test of the old 100mm macro L lens that I have, along with the control ring adapter, I shot a few frames of the flowers that I had bought to use in my tests as well. I absolutely love the soft tones that we get with the EOS R5, and at f4, at these close shooting distances, the bokeh is beautiful. I've been asked a lot about my settings for the EOS R5, so kind of as a second podcast embedded in this one, I have created a video to walk you through every settings screen on my EOS R5, and included specifically my settings for wildlife and fast-paced shooting, so I hope you find this useful. Note that I do not cover the video settings. Video is not my core competence, so I'll leave that to other reviewers. I don't go into full detail on every option either, but I do talk about all of the areas that I feel are important and why I make the selections that I do. The video also has chapters if you look at it on the blog, so check it out at mbp.ac/714. It's embedded near the bottom of the post. And if you click on the chapter markers in the timeline, you can jump to each individual settings group. Note that since I have also figured out what the difference is between the Auto 1 and Auto 2 on the Setup 3 screen/viewfinder display option. I couldn't figure out what was different initially, but since found out that Auto 1 switches between the viewfinder and the LCD screen based purely on whether or not the LCD screen is folded out into an open position. Basically, if the LCD screen is visible, it will be used, and the electronic viewfinder will only become visible after you fold the LCD screen away completely. In Auto 2 mode, the LCD screen can be visible when you put your eye to the viewfinder, and the viewfinder will activate regardless. So that's my choice of mode from now on. Okay, so there will be other things that I want to talk about, but I want to get this review out into the world, especially as the camera was a week late, and frankly not having support for the Canon EOS R5 in Capture One Pro caused me more headaches than I'd anticipated. So we'll blast this out now, and I'll follow up with any other findings as time and our not so friendly neighborhood virus allows. I would like to say though, in closing, that I have literally not been as excited about any camera in Canon's history as I am with the Canon EOS R5. I've been a Canon user since 1991, and I've owned some of their best cameras such as the 1DS Mark III and 1DX, but the R5 beats them all in almost every respect. Of course, the 1 series Canon cameras have much better weather sealing, and they are built like bricks, but that aside, the specifications and image quality of the R5 beats them all. I don't usually do star ratings, but if I was to rate this camera on a 5-star rating system, I'd honestly give it 10 stars. It really is a stellar camera. Even just using it every day in my studio over the last week has been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure that my wife is sick of hearing me say that Canon has really made something special this time. As I mentioned earlier, I was enabled by the kind folks at ProGrade Digital by sending me some of their amazing memory cards and a second card reader to test, and included in this and my previous review, although that does not affect how I report my findings to you in any way. Canon gives me zip, no gear, no preferential treatment. I buy all of my camera gear from a camera store here in Tokyo and use my own hard-earned yen. And I still can't say enough about this camera. So hopefully, all in all, you'll trust me when I say that all of the opinions that I have shared in this review are simply me telling it how I feel it is. I would like to just add that although I am aware that there is a lot of negative feedback going around about the EOS R5, I want you to be careful as you read or watch some of that stuff. I have always created my reviews straight from the heart and tell you exactly what I think about my gear. But that is not always true of people reviewing gear. Although I will skim the headlines, I don't read other reviews because I want to report my own findings without being influenced by others. One trend that I'm noticing more and more often though is that some reviewers will use negative reviews as a way to draw an audience. Why does this work? Because human nature is essentially flawed and people like to hear bad news. But also, many people that are sitting on the fence over new technology want to hear something bad about a product so that they can decide not to buy it. Personally, I like to make up my own mind. I'm a lone wolf in that respect. But some people need a push, and the negative reviews provide that push. I've also noticed that people with negative opinions can be very vocal. You'll see more people complaining about the overheating of the R5 than singing its praises for the amazing things that it brings us, because people like to defend their decisions not to buy it. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I bet there's a term for someone that deep down really wants the R5, but they protect their credit cards and probably their egos too by gathering and spreading negativity. My advice to you is for you to make up your own mind, but be aware that the naysayers say it louder and generally based on flawed motives. If you want to help to support the work that I do in bringing you these reviews, please consider using our affiliate links if you're going to buy any of these products. And I've placed a selection of them at the bottom of the blog post, and again, that is at mbp.ac/714. Thanks very much for listening today. If you enjoy this podcast, please share a link with your friends. Subscribe in iTunes or your favorite podcast program to ensure uninterrupted delivery. If you have a moment to rate the podcast or leave us a review in iTunes, that helps to keep us relevant in the huge number of podcasts out there now. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter and LinkedIn, and links to everything that I'm up to are at martinbaileyphotography.com, so do drop by and take a look. I'll be back next week with another episode, but in the meantime, you take care and have a great week whatever you're doing. Bye bye.